On the fateful night of May 31st, 2009, an Airbus A330-200 took off from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, bound for Paris, France. But it never finished the trip. The aircraft carried 216 passengers and 12 crew members. What should have been a routine transatlantic flight turned into one of the most tragic air disasters of the 21st century. After vanishing over the Atlantic Ocean, the wreckage lay undiscovered at the bottom of the sea for nearly 2 years before someone finally found it and solved the mystery of what happened. This is the story of Air France Flight 447. Air France Flight 447 was an Airbus A330-200, a modern airliner which was pretty well known for having an impressive safety record. It has advanced fly-by-wire technology, which allows for a high degree of automation in flight operations. This means that a pilot will engage the autopilot shortly after takeoff and let the tech handle a major chunk of the flight until landing. In the meanwhile, the crew focuses on monitoring systems and managing any anomalies. But you know what they say. Some things just shouldn't be left to robots. The flight on the night of May 31st was no different. It was commanded by a 58-year-old seasoned pilot, Captain Marc Dubois, who had clocked in over 11,000 flight hours. First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, age 32, was the least experienced of the crew, and even he had 3,300 flying hours, so no one expected for this flight to fail in the way that it did. Also on board was relief pilot David Robert, who was set to alternate with Captain Dubois during the flight. The plan was for Captain Dubois to rest, while Bonin and Robert took charge of the aircraft during the cruise phase over the Atlantic, a plan that would prove fatal. Flight 447 was supposed to take a route that went through the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a region that's notorious in the world of aviation for severe weather conditions, including towering cumulonimbus clouds that can produce violent turbulence and lightning. These conditions were pretty typical for flights in that region during this time of year, so pilots are usually able to successfully navigate around these storms using onboard weather radar. Around 1:30 a.m. on June 1st, Flight 447 had begun cruising at 35,000 feet over the South Atlantic. The flight had been smooth, and passengers were just setting up for their post-meal naps when suddenly, at 1:45 a.m., the plane began experiencing increasingly terrifying turbulence. The crew dimmed the cockpit lights as they entered a high-altitude cloud layer, and St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon caused by electrical discharges, became visible on the aircraft's surfaces, a sign of thunderstorms nearby. Every eye was wide open. 7 minutes later, the turbulence finally began to subside, and Captain Dubois confidently left the cockpit for a scheduled rest break, leaving First Officer Bonin and Relief Pilot Robert in command. They were now flying through a radar dead zone over the Atlantic, where communication with air traffic control would be super limited, so they needed to be on their A game. Despite the challenging conditions, the pilots were managing the flight pretty well. At 2:06 a.m., the pilots received a heads-up from a flight attendant about more turbulence ahead, so by 2:08 a.m., they had adjusted the plane's course slightly left to avoid the worst of it. What they didn't see coming was that the outside temperature plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius, and ice began to accumulate on the plane's pitot tubes. If you know anything about planes, you know those are crucial for measuring airspeed. Around 2:10 a.m., the iced pitot tubes started to produce erratic speed readings. This suddenly caused the autopilot to disengage, leaving the relief pilots to fend for themselves. From here on out, the situation began to deteriorate very rapidly. Although the pitot tubes failed only temporarily and resumed normal operation quickly, the aircraft was left in manual control, with Bonin as the pilot flying. The two pilots in control had to think quickly. For reasons that remain unclear to this day, First Officer Bonin decided to pull back on his side stick, causing the aircraft to pitch up sharply. This maneuver pushed the Airbus into a steep climb, reaching over 10 degrees nose up and ascending at thousands of feet per minute, soon surpassing its assigned altitude by a terrifying 3,000 feet. At 2:11 a.m., the stall warning began to blare in the cockpit as the plane, now at 38,000 feet, entered an aerodynamic stall, a critical condition where the wings lose the lift needed to keep the aircraft up in the air. Despite the alarms and the correct airspeed data being restored, Bonin for some reason continued to pull back on the controls instead of pushing forward to lower the nose and recover from the stall. It's important here that we take a pause and give you a quick refresher of the principles of flight. The principles of flight dictate that 4 primary forces act on an aircraft: thrust, drag, lift, and weight. In a stable flight, lift generated by the wings counteracts the aircraft's weight, while thrust from the engines overcomes drag. An aerodynamic stall occurs when the angle of attack, which is the angle between the wing and the oncoming air, is too steep, disrupting airflow over the wings and drastically reducing lift. Back on Flight 447, despite Bonin's actions, the plane continued its stalled descent. The aircraft started to lose altitude rapidly, falling at a rate of over 10,000 feet per minute. Imagine the horror of those passengers as they plummeted with horrifying speed towards the sea, all whilst trapped inside this metal giant of an Airbus. The stall warnings had ceased, and not because the plane had recovered. The plane had officially descended below the thresholds at which the sensors could even provide accurate data. Captain Dubois was rushed back into the cockpit, but by the time he arrived, it was too late to save the flight. For the next few minutes, the aircraft continued to descend into the Atlantic Ocean. The crew struggled to understand and react quickly to the multiple warnings and alarms blaring all at once. This was compounded by terrifying turbulence, darkness, and multiple system failures. Anyone would start to panic. The last recorded data from the flight shows the aircraft at 10,000 feet, now with a descent rate of 11,000 feet per minute, still stalled, with the nose-up attitude still uncorrected. At 2:14 a.m., Flight 447 completely disappeared from radar screens, and no one knew what was happening. The plane crashed straight into the Atlantic Ocean, taking the lives of all 228 people on board. The wreckage would not be found until April 2011, nearly 2 years after the accident. The black boxes, recovered from the ocean floor, would finally reveal the harrowing details of the final moments of Air France Flight 447. Before we dive into the investigation and its findings, I request you to please hit the subscribe and bell buttons. It helps us create more amazing content for you. Upon recovering the black boxes, the France's Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety concluded that the crash was primarily due to pilot error, and the situation was made worse by the malfunction of the pitot tubes, the crew's mismanagement of the aircraft during the autopilot disconnection, and obviously the subsequent stall were critical factors in the accident. The BEA found that First Officer Bonin's control inputs were completely inappropriate, and this was exacerbated by a lack of effective communication between the pilots. This is why the aircraft never recovered from the stall. The captain's absence from the cockpit at such a critical juncture and the overall failure of the crew resource management played significant roles in the outcome. The crash of Flight 447 has drawn attention to a lot of places where aviation safety could use serious improvement, including pilot training on manual flying skills, especially in high-altitude stall recovery, and better cockpit communication protocols. If you're an aspiring pilot wondering why your flight school wants to teach you a communication course, this is why. This incident is also what made Airbus redesign their pitot tubes and update procedures to address the issues encountered during the flight. Air France Flight 447 remains one of the most significant and cautionary tales in modern aviation history, and any good pilot will know about it. The loss of Flight 447 has not only changed how airlines approach pilot training, but also led to technological advancements aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Of course, while the lessons learned from this disaster continue to help us shape the safety protocols and training programs of airlines worldwide, nothing can ever make up for the 228 lives lost. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.